And I am here to talk to you a little bit about some of the research in this book, Dismantling Green Colonialism, which I had the privilege to co-edit with my colleague Hamza Ahmadjana, and working with authors from across North Africa and the Middle East. And this is, maybe before getting into the content, I'll say, you can also buy the book at our stand if you want to, but it is also available as a free EPUB online, and you can find that on our website or directly on the Pluto website if you like. So please feel free to access the free version, because we had to arm wrestle Pluto to get it, so go for it. So yeah, this book was published in 2023, and it was, we started the project some years before that. It was, as with every book, I suppose, a process to get to the final version, but it was inspired by this kind of realization that North Africa, the original focus of the work was North Africa, and then we expanded to cover also other countries in the Middle East. But the North Africa is quite a critical region, both are critical regions in the global kind of energy politics of today. They're critical in the climate crisis as well, right? So they're some of the most heavily impacted countries by the climate crisis because of their environment and ecology. But they've also been a center of the fossil empire and fossil fuel regime. And increasingly, and this is a trend that's continued to build since 2023, they're also really being targeted as a center for new green energy production. And what we see is that especially Europe, especially the European Union, is really targeting this region as a new source of cheap energy to fuel the continued industrialization and expansion of the European economy. And at the same time, in the kind of global climate justice discussions, both within movements, but even more especially in the intergovernmental climate spaces, a lot of voices from the region are really missing. And there's I think this has improved a little bit since 2023, but there is a fairly weak articulation between the global climate movements and movements in North Africa and the Middle East. And one of the things that looks like is that a lot of the language about climate and about green energy in the region is also very heavily captured by kind of neoliberal institutions, including the German government institutions, who are extremely active in this, especially GIZ, the German Development Corporation, but also the IMF, the World Bank, are pushing a very specific kind of climate agenda throughout the region, which diverges a lot from a more comprehensive kind of climate justice vision. And the framing of the book, the kind of originating framing of it was really about the idea of just transition, which is an idea that TNI has been working with global movements for more than a decade, but the idea itself goes back already to the 1970s, where it was originated by alliances of labor and climate justice movements as a way to talk about how climate action can fundamentally integrate the interests of workers and communities, and to kind of push back against this false opposition that capital tries to stoke between affected communities and workers. So the idea of just transition was developed as a kind of an answer to this, and how we talk about the transition in a way that takes those different interests into account, and that's based around the protagonism of working people in all their diversity. But as with any lovely concept, it's also been subject to a lot of capture. So we're seeing increasingly the idea of just transition being, especially since it was included in the preamble of the Paris Agreement, it's being watered down, and it's being used by corporations and by governments in a way that doesn't reflect the kind of radical content of it that you might like to see. I'll say in North Africa, actually, the term itself is not even used, it's not even being appropriated, it's just not being used. So this book was partially an effort to also put on the table this idea of a kind of a bottom-up vision of climate justice and climate action. So I'll say a bit about the kind of general themes and conclusions of the book, and I'll talk a little bit about what it means specifically in the context of occupation and genocide. The book was published in November 2023, so it was finalized in August of 2023, so it reflects the position before the beginning of the current genocide. But I think a lot of there are several chapters on Palestine and on Western Sahara, which I think are still quite relevant for thinking about the relationships between climate justice and national liberation and resistance. So, yeah, as I said already, as I mentioned, there is this enormous potential for green energy in North Africa and the Middle East, both from solar power and from wind power. And that's being kind of seen and capitalized on by imperialist powers, especially, but not exclusively, the EU. And in the last few years, that's increasingly taking the dynamic of development of what's being called green hydrogen, so using renewable energy to produce hydrogen, which can then be transported through existing oil infrastructure. But the way that development is happening, as probably surprises no one in this room, the way that development is happening is falling very far short of what we might call a just transition. And I'll talk. Oh.
It's the battery, I think.
Woohoo.
Uh-oh.
I thought I seemed quieter.
Hello?
Maybe the batteries.
Yeah, it's the battery.
I'll go and try to get the tech help.
Yeah. Well, we have another microphone here, but then we have to move a little bit.
This one.
Can we move a little bit? Maybe it's easier.
I think that.
Up.
Hello, hello.
Hello?
Hello. Hello, hello.
No?
Hello.
Oh. I think maybe it needs a little bit more.
I may keep talking.
Hello, hello. Testing.
Is it getting
Yeah.
louder?
Yeah, I think
I
that's
think it's
good.
working.
I really don't know what I'm doing.
It's okay?
Yeah, a little bit closer and then it's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Perfect.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, everyone. Thanks for
apologize.
flagging. So yeah, as I was saying, the way that green energy is being developed in North Africa and the Middle East is falling very far short of what we might consider a just transition, or yeah, kind of genuine climate action consistent with climate justice. And there are a couple of kind of key ways in which that's true, which I'll run through kind of quickly, and I'll give only a few kind of light examples, but if people want more details, feel free to ask. I think the first important point to emphasize is that the way that green energy is being developed in the region is really based around a paradigm of extractivism. So energy is being created primarily for export, and as I mentioned, for export to the European Union. That's being done in a context where most of the countries in the region are, for their own energy, dependent on fossil fuels, in many cases on imported fossil fuels, in the case of Algeria and obviously the Gulf states, on fossil fuel domestically produced, but countries like Tunisia are importing fossil fuels from Algeria, are vulnerable economically as a result of that, and at the same time are producing huge amounts of energy for export to Europe. And it's worth saying that's true at the national level, and it's doubly true at the local level. So the local communities who are in the area where energy developments are being built very frequently are not even connected to the national grids and are not benefiting directly from the power that's being produced in their backyards. Also problematic, and I think also significant, is that development is often also being driven by privatization. This is perhaps especially relevant for this crowd, is that in most countries, in order to facilitate the capitalist development of renewable energy generation, public utility companies are being split up and sold off. And energy systems which were state-run public utilities are being privatized. This is maybe most dramatically true in Tunisia, where the unions of the Tunisian energy workers have played a very important role in pushing back and in organizing resistance against this kind of energy model. The whole development is also characterized by a really strong interference, I would say, in policy making by especially European governments. So we see, as I mentioned, GIZ, the German Development Corporation, effectively writing energy policy for the Tunisian government. They have, literally established their offices inside the same building, and policy documents appear as joint publications of the Tunisian government and the GIZ. So there's quite a deep undemocratic tendency going on there in countries where there are already very serious democratic deficits, let's say. But that European governments are also taking advantage of that. And all of this, in the same way we argue in the book, is really recapitulating dynamics of imperialism and of dependency, right? So countries are being pushed back into a position of exporting raw materials and importing high technology, high value added products like solar panels and windmills, which are not made locally, which are being made in Europe and in Asia. And they're being continually pushed into this position of economic subordination, of having to just export raw materials obtained by dispossessing local people, which is the next point I wanted to talk about. You hear throughout the discussions of green energy in North Africa and the Middle East, you hear this idea of the deserts as these empty spaces which are waiting to be used for something, right? It's fine, we can produce all of the energy we need in the world just by covering the Sahara in solar panels. Most of the land where these developments are being planned is land that is occupied and that is used by indigenous people. It's used as grazing land for a large part of it, or it's used as traditional trade and migration routes. And those people are really invisibilized in the government policies, but also in the international discourse around this land. And we talk about that in the book. I'll say a little more later about it, but we talk about that in the framework of green Orientalism. So this kind of imaginary of the East as empty, and of the landscape as defective, and of the people as surplus. So this is a deeply colonial way of envisioning that space and those people. And then lastly, throughout the region, we see the kind of model of green development also being used as a form of greenwashing, being used to justify and to legitimate occupation. We see that in the case of Palestine, where Israel aggressively touted its project to make the desert bloom and to green Palestine, as if this is something that Palestinians could not do, and as if this so-called civilizing influence was needed. And this extends to things like building wind farms on occupied Palestinian territory. The same is true in Western Sahara, where the Moroccan government is touting itself as an absolute champion of green energy in the region, on the grounds of green energy developments, which it's building in occupied Western Sahara. And in order to kind of gain this international legitimacy as an important climate actor. So I think those are kind of critical patterns that we see across the region. And I think it's important to say that these need to be understood as part of longer historical patterns and wider political trends, right? So this is about recapitulating the kind of extractivism that has taken place historically under colonialism in the region, which was fossil fuel extraction, now renewable extraction or green extractivism. It reinforces this idea of green Orientalism, this idea that the civilizing influence of the West is necessary to transform or reform these deserted landscapes, these desert landscapes, and to enforce a different kind of ecological reality on them. And I think it's reinscribing, this part is not so much in the book because of the changing context, but reinscribing an idea which has subsequently been described as eco-apartheid. So this push towards a world in which a small number of people are living in a green utopian future, and the vast majority of humanity is violently excluded from that future. So I think the the fundamental argument of the book, or the argument that I want to discuss with all of you here today, is that this kind of new vision of green extractivism is really a fundamental dynamic of imperialist capitalism today, right? I think in most places that I'm presenting this book, I'm presenting it primarily to climate activists. I assume there are climate activists here, but I think there are also a diversity of people from other movements. I'll be interested to hear. With climate activists, generally we are making the point that it's not feasible or viable to deal with the climate crisis inside or without resisting the framework of imperialist capitalism. And that's a core argument of the book. But in this case, I think I'm also interested to explore the inverse of that, right? Can we deal with the dynamics of imperialist capitalism without contesting those dynamics of green extractivism and of eco-apartheid? And I would argue also no. These struggles need to be fundamentally entwined with each other. And I think that's true as well, or that this also implies that the military apparatus of genocide, of apartheid, of militarized borders that are increasingly being used to kind of underwrite and protect this extractive regime also needs to be a core target of all our movements. And then likewise, I think the book also reveals in a lot of ways that the global financial architecture, so the debt, the imposed debt on the colonized world, but also things like intellectual property regimes, which are actively impeding the possibility for these countries to develop their own actual internal economies, that these are also actively blocking global economic justice, of course, but also climate justice. So the kind of concluding message there, which I feel is not a radical one in this space, but is in some, is that what we need is a cohesive, internationalist, and united struggle for liberation, for justice, for debt abolition, for reparations, technology transfer, and democracy, and that is kind of the flesh on the bones of what we mean when we talk about just transition and about energy democracy. So what I hope we can discuss in the collective discussion coming up is a little bit more concretely about what this means for the movements and for the struggles that you all are involved with here in the Netherlands. How does that play out? And I came with a couple of questions, which I can read, which are just my own questions for you. You don't have to answer them, but we can think about them together. One, the obvious low-hanging one is how can we build stronger alliances with labor unions, but also with affected communities in North Africa and the Middle East and around the world to build a more internationalist movement? How do we see the role of the state in these conflicts and struggles? What does it mean, for instance, to fight for, to advocate for energy democracy inside countries which are effectively dictatorships? And what, from the perspective of the Netherlands, what should be our relationship to those struggles? How do we see, as socialists, how do we see the struggles which are often characterized as the environmentalism of the poor? So struggles of communities against their own dispossession, against extractivism? And how, do we see people involved in those struggles as a revolutionary subject? And how do we see the relation between them and the urban proletariat? How do we integrate struggles against militarism, against eco-apartheid, against unjust trade regimes into our other struggles to form a more unified struggle? And then lastly, because this is in my mind lately, so I can throw it out to all of you, what should we make of the kind of right-wing attack on the architecture of international trade? And how should we relate to the kind of rising new right-wing resource nationalism? What does that mean for these different struggles? And how can we combat and push back against this ideology of eco-apartheid, which seems to be deepening inside Europe. So those are a couple of just starting questions to get us going.
Great.